Princess Kira stood at the highest tower of her palace and watched the three moons rise over the crystalline city of Elvara, and the light reflected off 1,000 glass spires, creating patterns that had mesmerized her since childhood. But tonight, her mind was elsewhere, and her thoughts kept returning to decisions made long ago. Her dragons Ember and Frost lay beside her, with their massive bodies curled protectively around the tower platform, and Ember's silver scales caught the moonlight, while Frost's golden ones seemed to glow from within, and they had been her companions since she was a child, and they understood her moods better than any living being in the kingdom. The palace below buzzed with activity, as servants prepared for the upcoming celestial festival, and nobles arrived from distant provinces to pay their respects and participate in the ancient ceremonies. But Kira felt a growing unease that she could not explain to anyone, and not even to her dragons, who nudged her gently with their massive heads. She reached out and stroked Ember's snout, and the dragon purred deep in its throat, and the vibration traveled through the stone beneath her feet, and Frost opened one golden eye and watched her with an intelligence that sometimes frightened even Kira herself, because dragons were ancient creatures, and they remembered things that elves preferred to forget. 10 cycles had passed since she made the hardest decision of her life, and she had exiled a human woman, named Luna Blake, from Elvara, and sent her away on a ship headed for the outer colonies. And Luna had discovered something in the royal archives, and something that could destroy everything the royal family had built over thousands of years. Kira remembered that day with painful clarity, and Luna had been working as a researcher and studying ancient elven texts and translating documents that no one had read in centuries. And she was brilliant and curious, and those qualities had led her to find what should have remained hidden forever. The secret was simple but devastating, and the first queen of Elvara had not been purely elven as history claimed, and she had been something else, and something that came from beyond the known stars. And the entire foundation of elven nobility and their claims of pure bloodlines and superior heritage was built on a lie. When Luna brought her findings to Kira, the princess had been faced with an impossible choice, and she could acknowledge the truth and watch her civilization collapse into chaos, or she could silence the human and protect her people from a truth they were not ready to hear. Kira had chosen exile instead of execution, because Luna had done nothing wrong except seek knowledge, and the human woman had accepted her fate with dignity, and she had looked at Kira with those dark, intelligent eyes and said that truth always finds a way, and someday it would come back to find them both. The princess shook her head and tried to clear the memories away, and that was 10 cycles ago, and Luna was light years away by now, and living a new life on some distant world, and there was no reason for Kira to keep thinking about her, except that she did, and every day she wondered if she had made the right choice. Ember suddenly raised her head and her nostrils flared, and Frost jumped to his feet with surprising speed for such a massive creature, and both dragons stared toward the dark forest that bordered the eastern edge of the city, and their bodies tensed and their scales began to shimmer with defensive energy. Kira felt her heart rate increase, and she trusted her dragons completely, and if they sensed danger, then danger was real, and she stood and placed her hand on the ceremonial blade at her hip, and the weapon had been passed down through generations of royal defenders, and it hummed with ancient power. She reached out with her mind and touched the consciousness of her dragons, and asked what they sensed, but their response was confusing, and they felt both threat and familiarity and fear and recognition, and it was as if something they once knew had returned but changed in ways they could not comprehend. The princess made a decision quickly, and she commanded her dragons to follow, and together they descended from the tower and moved through the palace corridors, and guards snapped to attention as she passed, but she did not slow down or offer explanations. They emerged into the palace gardens, and the flowering trees swayed in the night breeze, and the scent of moon blossoms filled the air. But Kira barely noticed, because her attention was fixed on the forest edge, and there in the shadows between the trees, she saw a figure standing motionless. Figure wore a cloak that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, and it shimmered like starlight captured in fabric. And Kira's breath caught, because she knew that cloak, and she had given it to Luna as a parting gift when she sent her into exile, and it had been woven from rare materials and enchanted to protect the wearer from harsh environments. Ember, and Frost moved to flank Kira, and their bodies created a protective barrier, but their growls were uncertain and mixed with whimpers of confusion, and the princess forced herself to walk forward and cross the manicured gardens toward the wild forest. Beyond, palace guards called out and asked if she needed escort, but she waved them back and ordered them to remain at their posts, and this was something she needed to face alone, and with only her dragons beside her. As she approached the forest edge, the figure became clearer, and it was definitely human in shape and size. But there was something different about the way it stood, and the way the air seemed to bend around it, and Kira felt her magical senses tingling with warning. She stopped 20 paces from the figure and commanded it to identify itself, and her voice carried the authority of generations of rulers and the power to compel obedience from any creature in her realm. But the figure did not respond immediately. Instead, it raised its hand slowly and pulled back the hood of the starlight cloak, and Kira felt the world shift beneath her feet, because the face revealed was Luna Blake and the human woman she had exiled 10 cycles ago. But this was Luna, and yet not Luna. And the woman's face was the same, and her dark hair and sharp features unchanged, but her eyes had transformed, and they held depths that seemed to stretch into infinity, and they glowed faintly with colors that did not exist in normal space. Luna smiled and spoke, and her voice echoed strangely as if it came from multiple places at once, and she greeted Kira by her full royal title, and Princess Kira Moonwhisper of the Eternal Court, and Keeper of the Crystal Throne and Guardian of the Three Moons. Kira demanded to know how Luna had returned, and every border was watched and every ship monitored, and the exile decree prevented her from ever setting foot on Elvara again on pain of death, and yet here she stood. Luna laughed softly, and the sound made the nearby trees shiver, and she explained that she was no longer bound by decrees or borders or the limitations that once defined her, and exile had been a gift, though Kira had not meant it as such, and it had freed her to seek truths beyond what either of them had imagined. The princess felt Ember and Frost pressing close, and their fear was palpable now, and these creatures, who had lived for centuries and fought in countless battles, were trembling, and Luna noticed and commented that the dragons remembered, and somewhere in their ancient memories, they recognized what she had become. Kira asked what Luna meant, and what had happened during the 10 cycles of exile, and Luna stepped forward, and the princess instinctively stepped back, and her hand on her blade tightened. The human woman explained that she had traveled far beyond the colonized worlds, and beyond even the mapped regions of space, and she had found something in the void between galaxies, and something ancient and powerful and waiting, and it had been calling to her even before she discovered the truth about the elven bloodline. Luna continued, and she said that the entity she found was neither alive nor dead, and it existed outside normal dimensions, and it had offered her knowledge and power beyond imagination in exchange for something simple, and it wanted to experience the physical universe through her and to understand existence through mortal eyes. Kira felt ice forming in her stomach, and she asked if Luna was possessed, and if some demon or void creature had taken control of her body, and Luna shook her head and explained it was more like a partnership and a merging, and she was still herself but enhanced and expanded and capable of things that would seem like magic even to elves. The princess knew she should call her guards and mobilize her defenses, but something held her back, and perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was guilt over the exile, or perhaps it was the look in Luna's transformed eyes that suggested she already knew every thought Kira was having. Luna spoke again, and she said she had not returned for revenge or to expose the secret that led to her exile, and instead she had returned with an offer and a chance to change everything for Elvara, and for the elven people, and for the entire sector of space. They called home. Kira asked what kind of offer, and Luna's smile widened, and she said she had learned things during her travels and technologies and techniques and knowledge that could advance Elvara by centuries, and she could share it all and freely and without condition, except one. The princess waited, and Luna finally revealed her price, and she wanted her name restored and her reputation cleared, and a position as royal advisor, and recognition that her exile had been based on political necessity rather than any crime she had committed. Kira's mind raced, and she weighed the options and the consequences and the risks, and Luna stood patiently and waited, and behind her the forest seemed to grow darker and deeper and more mysterious. Kira studied Luna's face and searched for any sign of deception or malice, but found only patience and confidence, and the certainty of someone who held all the advantages and knew it, and the princess realized she was negotiating from a position of weakness. And that was a new experience for someone born to absolute power. Ember shifted nervously beside her, and the dragon's silver scales rippled with protective energy. And Frost growled low and deep, but neither dragon moved to attack, and they seemed to understand that this human woman was now something far beyond their ability to harm or intimidate. The princess made her decision and spoke carefully, and said she would consider Luna's offer, but needed time to think and to consult with her advisors, and Luna tilted her head and studied Kira with those infinite eyes and said that time was something she had plenty of, but patience was not. Luna extended her hand and palm up, and in it appeared a small crystal that pulsed with inner light, and she explained that this was a gift and a demonstration of good faith, and Kira should place it in the palace archives, and in 3 days it would activate and reveal just one small portion of the knowledge Luna could provide. The human woman continued and said that if Kira was impressed with what the crystal revealed, then they could discuss terms further, and if not, then Luna would leave Elvara and never return, and the secret that the princess had worked so hard to protect would remain buried forever. Kira hesitated and then reached out and took the crystal, and it was warm in her palm and seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. And Luna smiled and said the crystal was attuned to royal blood, and only Kira or her direct descendants could activate it, and anyone else who tried would find it inert and useless. Before Kira could ask more questions, Luna pulled her hood back up and turned toward the forest, and the shadows seemed to welcome her and embrace her, and within moments she had vanished completely, and leaving no trace that she had ever been there except for the crystal in Kira's hand. The princess stood frozen for several minutes, and her mind struggling to process everything that had happened, and Ember nudged her gently, and Frost made a questioning sound deep in his throat, and finally Kira turned and walked back toward the palace. She did not summon her advisors or inform the guards about what had transpired, and instead she went directly to her private chambers and dismissed her attendants and locked the doors behind her, and only then did she allow herself to truly react to the encounter. Her hands shook as she examined the crystal, and it was beautiful in a way that seemed almost alive, and the light within it shifted and changed, and formed patterns that reminded her of star systems and galaxies, and the vast emptiness of space between them. Kira had questions, and so many questions, and how had Luna traveled back without being detected, and what exactly was this entity she had merged with, and what were its true intentions, and most importantly, could the princess trust anything that Luna had told her? Sleep did not come easily that night, and Kira lay in her bed and stared at the crystal on her nightstand, and its soft glow filled the room and cast strange shadows on the walls, and in her dreams she saw Luna walking through an endless void, and behind her stretched a wake of stardust and possibility. The next 3 days passed in a blur of official duties and ceremonial obligations, and Kira performed her role as princess perfectly, while her mind remained preoccupied with the crystal and the choice she would soon have to make, and she told no one about Luna's visit and kept the crystal hidden in her personal chambers. She noticed that Ember and Frost were more protective than usual, and they rarely left her side and seemed constantly alert for any sign of danger, and the other dragons in the royal flights sensed their unease, and the entire palace took on a subtle tension that no one could quite explain. On the morning of the 3rd day, Kira woke before dawn and took the crystal to the deepest level of the palace archives, and this was a place few people ever visited, and it housed records and artifacts dating back to the founding of Elvara, and the walls were lined with ancient texts and mysterious objects whose purposes had been forgotten. She found a private chamber and sealed the door behind her and placed the crystal on a pedestal in the center of the room, and then she stepped back and waited, and the crystal began to pulse faster and brighter, and the light grew until it filled the entire chamber. Suddenly images began to appear in the air around her, and they were technical diagrams and mathematical formulas and designs for devices she had never seen before, and they rotated slowly, and each one was labeled in both Elven script and human standard, and she realized she was looking at blueprints for advanced technology. Kira recognized some concepts from her own education, and she saw improvements to their energy systems and methods for faster space travel and medical techniques that could extend lifespans and cure diseases that currently had no treatment, and each design was complete and detailed and ready to be implemented. She reached out and touched one of the floating diagrams, and immediately her mind was flooded with additional information, and she understood not just what the device was, but how it worked and why and the principles behind it. And it was as if she had studied the subject for years in just an instant. The princess spent hours in that chamber and examined dozens of the designs, and each one was revolutionary, and each one could transform some aspect of elven society, and together they represented a leap forward that would take centuries to achieve through normal research and development. But Kira was not naive, and she understood that accepting this knowledge came with obligations, and Luna would expect her position and her influence and her presence in the palace, and giving a human woman such power would cause controversy among the noble houses, and many elves still viewed humans as inferior and unworthy of elevated status. When the crystal finally dimmed and the images faded, Kira sat on the cold stone floor and tried to make sense of her options, and she could reject Luna's offer and maintain the status quo and keep the secret buried and hope that no one else ever discovered the truth about the royal bloodline. Or she could accept and bring Elvara into a new age of prosperity and advancement, but risk everything on trusting a human woman who had merged with something unknown and potentially dangerous, and who had every reason to harbor resentment about her exile. The princess stood and picked up the crystal, and it was cool now and dormant, and she slipped it into a hidden pocket in her robe and made her way back to the upper levels of the palace, and her decision was not yet final, but she knew which way she was leaning. That evening, she summoned her most trusted advisor and an elderly elf named Theron, who had served her father and grandfather before her, and he entered her private study and bowed low and asked how he could serve. Kira asked him a hypothetical question, and she said, "Suppose someone offered to share incredible knowledge and technology that could benefit all of Elvara, but that person was controversial, and their presence would cause political difficulties, and what would he advise?" Theron considered carefully, and then asked if this knowledge came with hidden costs or obligations. And Kira admitted she did not know for certain, but suspected there might be complications down the road, and the old advisor nodded and said, "That was always the way with gifts that seemed too good to be true." He asked another question and wanted to know if refusing the offer would leave Elvara vulnerable or at a disadvantage compared to other civilizations. And Kira realized that was something she had not fully considered, and if Luna took her knowledge elsewhere and shared it with rival powers, then Elvara might find itself technologically inferior and strategically weak. Theron saw the realization on her face and said that sometimes the most dangerous choice was inaction, and refusing to adapt and refusing to change even when change was necessary, and the elven people had survived for millennia by being wise enough to know when old ways needed to be set aside. Kira thanked him and dismissed him, and sat alone in her study as the moons rose outside her window, and she knew what she had to do, even though it frightened her, and even though it would cause upheaval and controversy and possibly even rebellion among the more traditional noble houses. She went to her balcony where Ember and Frost waited, and the dragons sensed her resolve and pressed their massive heads against her and offered their silent support, and she spoke to them quietly and told them that tomorrow everything would change. That night she drafted a formal decree, and it announced that Luna Blake was pardoned and her exile revoked, and she would be welcomed back to Elvara as a royal advisor and honored guest. And the decree claimed that new evidence had come to light proving that Luna's research had been misunderstood, and her exile had been an unfortunate mistake. Kira knew the decree was full of careful lies and diplomatic language, but it would serve its purpose and give Luna the public rehabilitation she had demanded. And the princess added one more provision, and Luna would be given access to the palace archives and research facilities, but her work would be monitored and reviewed by a committee of trusted scholars. She sealed the decree with her royal signet and knew that by morning it would be distributed throughout Elvara and to all the provincial governors and noble houses, and there would be questions and objections and probably formal protests, but it would be done. The news of Luna's pardon spread through Elvara like wildfire, and within hours the entire capital was buzzing with speculation and rumor and shock, and the noble houses reacted exactly as Kira had predicted, with formal letters of protest and demands for explanation and thinly veiled threats about withdrawing their support. Kira spent 3 exhausting days meeting with governors and nobles and council members and explaining her decision over and over again, and each time she emphasized the benefits that Luna's knowledge could bring and carefully avoided any mention of the deeper reasons for the original exile. Lord Valen of House Silverleaf was particularly vocal in his opposition, and he stood in the council chamber and declared that allowing a human such elevated status was an insult to elven tradition and dignity, and several other nobles murmured agreement. The princess listened patiently, and then reminded them that humans had been part of the Elvara alliance for over 50 years, and many served with distinction in various roles throughout the kingdom. And Luna's appointment was unusual, but not unprecedented. Lady Thera of House Moonstone asked the question that many were thinking, and she wanted to know what had really changed Kira's mind and why a researcher who had been exiled for supposedly dangerous activities was suddenly being welcomed back as an honored advisor. Kira had prepared for this question, and she explained that further investigation had revealed Luna's research had been misunderstood and her findings were academically sound, and the exile had been ordered during a time of political tension. And now, with calmer consideration, the princess realized the punishment had been too harsh. It was not entirely a lie, but it was far from the complete truth. And Kira could see that some of the nobles were not convinced, but her authority as princess was absolute in matters of royal appointments, and they could protest, but not prevent her decision. On the 5th day after issuing the decree, Kira stood on the palace landing platform with Ember and Frost beside her, and watched as a small ship descended from the sky, and it was not a vessel from any known fleet, and its design was strange and seemed to shift slightly as she looked at it, as if it existed partially in another dimension. The ship landed smoothly and the boarding ramp extended, and Luna Blake walked out, and she wore simple, elegant clothing rather than the starlight cloak, and she looked almost normal except for her eyes, which still held those impossible depths. Palace guards formed an honor corridor, and their faces showed varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity, and Luna walked between them with perfect confidence, and stopped before Kira and bowed with exactly the correct depth and duration for someone greeting a princess. Kira welcomed her formally and announced that the palace and its resources were at Luna's disposal, and she hoped their collaboration would benefit. All of Elvara and Luna thanked her with equal formality, and the entire exchange was carefully choreographed for the watching guards and servants and officials. But when their eyes met, Kira saw something in Luna's expression, and it was gratitude, mixed with something else and perhaps amusement at the political theater they were performing. And the princess felt a strange connection, and they were two people keeping the same dangerous secret and bound together by knowledge that could destroy them both. Kira personally escorted Luna to her new quarters, and they were spacious rooms in the palace's west wing, and usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, and the chambers had a private study and access to a small garden and a view of the city below. Once they were alone and the servants dismissed, Kira asked the question that had been burning in her mind for days, and she wanted to know what Luna truly was now, and how much of her remained human, and how much had been changed by the entity she merged with. Luna sat in one of the comfortable chairs and invited Kira to do the same. And then she explained in detail what had happened during her exile, and after she left Elvara she had continued her research and traveled to ancient sites on dozens of worlds and searched for evidence about the origins of the elven bloodline. Her journey eventually took her beyond mapped space and into regions where reality grew thin and unstable, and there, in the void between galaxies, she encountered something that existed outside normal understanding, and it called itself the Archive, and it had been collecting knowledge and experience and memory from countless civilizations for millions of years. The Archive was not hostile or benevolent, and it simply was, and it existed to observe and learn and understand. And when it encountered Luna, it recognized her as a seeker of truth and offered a partnership, and she could access all of its accumulated knowledge in exchange for allowing it to experience physical existence through her senses. Luna had accepted, and the merging was gradual and consensual, and she remained herself, but enhanced. And she could now perceive things that normal beings could not, and understand concepts that would take lifetimes to learn and access technologies that seem like magic. Kira listened and felt both fascinated and terrified, and she asked if the archive had any agenda or purpose beyond observation, and Luna admitted she did not know for certain, and their partnership was still new and evolving. And she was learning to navigate the strange existence of being partially human and partially something far older and stranger. The princess then asked the harder question and wanted to know why. Luna had really returned, and was it truly just to reclaim her reputation? Or was there some other purpose? And Luna smiled and said that both things were true. And she wanted vindication, but she also believed that Elvira needed what she could offer. Luna explained that she had observed other civilizations during her travels and seen how many were advancing rapidly, while Elvira remained relatively stagnant and clinging to traditions that limited growth. And if the elven people did not adapt, they would eventually be left behind or conquered or absorbed by more dynamic cultures. Kira felt defensive but also recognized the truth in Luna's words. And the elven civilization was ancient and proud, but perhaps that pride had become an obstacle, and the princess asked what Luna proposed. Luna stood and walked to the window and looked out over the crystalline city, and said she would begin by establishing a research institute, and it would be staffed by both elven and human scientists, and they would study and implement the technologies she brought, and the goal was not to abandon elven culture, but to strengthen it by giving them tools to protect themselves and thrive. She also suggested educational reforms and ways to encourage more creativity and innovation among young elves who were currently trained to value tradition and obedience over experimentation and questioning. And Kira realized that Luna was proposing changes that would reshape their entire society. The princess stood and joined Luna at the window, and admitted she was afraid, and not just of the political consequences, but of losing something essential about what made Elvira unique. And Luna nodded and said that fear was valid, but sometimes survival required change, even when change was frightening. They spent hours discussing details and logistics and potential obstacles, and by the time Kira left Luna's quarters, they had outlined a plan for the first year of their collaboration, and it was ambitious, but achievable, and if successful, it would prove the value of Luna's presence and silence many of her critics. Over the following weeks, Luna settled into palace life, and she met with scholars and scientists, and began sharing carefully selected pieces of knowledge. And her first project was an improved medical scanner that could detect diseases years before symptoms appeared, and the prototype was built quickly, and the results were undeniable. The medical community was astonished, and several prominent physicians who had initially opposed Luna's appointment now requested to work with her, and Kira watched as public opinion slowly began to shift, and people started to see the benefits rather than just the controversy. But not everyone was convinced, and Lord Valen continued to organize opposition among conservative nobles, and he gave speeches warning that human influence would corrupt elven purity, and argued that Luna's knowledge came from suspicious sources and could not be trusted. Kira met with Valen privately and tried to address his concerns, but found him immovable, and he believed deeply that elves were superior to other species, and any suggestion otherwise was heresy, and the princess realized he would remain an opponent, no matter what evidence she provided. Meanwhile, Luna's research institute took shape in a building near the palace, and it was equipped with the finest facilities and staffed by volunteer researchers who were excited to work with revolutionary new concepts and technologies, and the atmosphere was electric with possibility and discovery. Ember and Frost gradually accepted Luna's presence, though they never fully relaxed around her, and Kira noticed that other animals in the palace also reacted strangely to the human woman, and birds would fall silent when she passed, and cats would watch her with unblinking attention, as if they sensed something beyond normal perception. One evening, Kira visited Luna's study and found her working late and surrounded by floating holographic displays that showed complex mathematical formulas and star charts, and Luna looked up and smiled and invited the princess to sit. 6 months after Luna's return, the tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of elven society finally erupted into open crisis, and Lord Valen led a coalition of conservative nobles in demanding a formal inquiry into Luna's background and her sources of knowledge and the true circumstances of her original exile. Kira knew this moment would come, and she had prepared as best she could. But standing in the Grand Council chamber and facing dozens of hostile nobles made her realize how precarious her position had become. And if the truth about the royal bloodline emerged now, it would destroy not just her family, but the entire structure of elven government. Balin spoke first, and his voice rang through the marble hall, and he accused Luna of practicing forbidden arts and dealing with entities from beyond normal space and bringing dangerous influences into the heart of Elvara, and he demanded that she be examined by the temple priests and her research facilities closed, until her methods could be verified as safe. Other nobles added their voices, and Lady Thera expressed concern that Luna's technologies were advancing too quickly and without proper testing, and what if something went wrong and harmed people, and Lord Kalen from the border provinces worried that humans throughout the kingdom would use Luna's elevation as justification for demanding equal status with elves. Kira listened to each speaker and maintained her composure, even as anger built inside her, and when they finished, she stood and walked to the center of the chamber, and her presence commanded attention and silence fell. The princess spoke clearly and firmly, and reminded the council that every technology Luna introduced had been thoroughly tested and proven safe, and the medical scanner alone had already saved dozens of lives by detecting cancers and diseases in their earliest stages, and the agricultural improvements were feeding thousands more people with the same amount of land. She challenged the nobles directly and asked if they were willing to return to the old ways and give up the benefits they and their families were already enjoying. And would they tell the farmers to destroy their improved crops, and would they tell the sick to refuse treatment from advanced medical equipment? Valen responded that safety and benefit were not the only considerations, and the soul of elven civilization was at stake, and if they abandoned their traditions and pure bloodlines in pursuit of progress, they would cease to be elven and become something else. Kira saw her opening and spoke carefully and asked what exactly made someone truly elven, and was it blood or culture or values or something else? And Valen answered immediately that it was blood and the ancient lineages that stretched back to the founding, and that purity was what separated elves from other lesser species. The princess then revealed something she had kept secret even from her closest advisors, and she told the council that she had commissioned a genetic study of the noble houses, and the results showed that every single bloodline, including the royal family, had human ancestors at some point in their history. The chamber erupted in shouting and denial, and Valen accused her of lies and forgery. But Kira raised her hand and said the records were available for anyone who wished to verify them. And the truth was that elven genetic superiority was a myth, and they had always been a mixed people, and their strength came from culture and values, not from blood purity. It was a calculated risk, and Kira was revealing part of the secret that Luna had discovered, but framing it in a way that made it seem like recent scientific findings rather than ancient historical fact, and she was gambling that the nobles would be too shocked to dig deeper and question the original sources. Lord Valen looked like he might physically attack her, but the other nobles were talking among themselves and looking confused and uncertain, and Lady Thera asked why this information had been kept from them, and Kira explained that previous rulers had believed the myth of purity helped maintain social order, but now with humans as full partners in the alliance, the lie had become a liability. The debate continued for hours, and gradually the tone shifted from outrage to reluctant acceptance, and some nobles remained hostile, but others began to see that Kira's revelation actually solved several problems. And if blood purity was not real, then there was no logical basis for considering humans inferior, and Luna's appointment made more sense. By the end of the session, Valen and his closest supporters had stormed out, but the majority of the council voted to allow Luna's work to continue under increased oversight, and they established a review board that would examine each new technology before public release. And Kira accepted these terms, knowing it was the best outcome she could achieve. That evening, she found Luna on the palace walls and looking out over the city with her eternal mysterious expression. And Kira told her what had happened in the council, and how she had revealed the genetic study, and Luna nodded and said it was a clever solution and a way to release some truth without destroying everything. The princess asked if Luna was disappointed that the full historical secret remained buried, and Luna turned to look at her with those infinite eyes and said that truth took many forms, and sometimes partial truth was more useful than complete revelation. And what mattered was that Elvara was moving forward, rather than remaining trapped in the past. Kira felt relief but also unease because she wondered what other truths Luna was keeping to herself and what the archive knew that had not yet been shared. And the human woman seemed to sense her thoughts, and said that knowledge had its own timing, and some things could only be understood when consciousness was ready to receive them. Over the following months, the review board examined Luna's technologies and approved most of them after rigorous testing, and a few were deemed too advanced and potentially dangerous. But overall, the flow of innovation continued, and Elvara entered a period of rapid advancement that historians would later call the Awakening. The Research Institute expanded and opened satellite facilities in 3 provincial capitals, and young elves and humans competed for positions there, and the old divisions between species began to blur as they worked together on projects that benefited everyone. But success brought new challenges, and other civilizations noticed Elvara's sudden technological leap, and trade delegations arrived, from rival star systems wanting to negotiate access to the new technologies, and some offered wealth and resources, while others made barely veiled threats. Kira found herself conducting complex diplomatic negotiations while trying to protect Luna's knowledge from being stolen or misused, and she relied heavily on Luna's advice during these meetings because the human woman could sense deception in ways that elves could not, and the archive apparently could perceive truth and lies by analyzing subtle patterns in behavior and speech. One delegation from the Krill Collective was particularly aggressive, and their ambassador demanded that Elvara share its technological advances as a member of the galactic community. And when Kira refused, politely he became threatening and suggested that the collective might take military action if cooperation was not forthcoming. Luna attended that meeting and sat quietly beside Kira's throne and said nothing, but the Krill ambassador became increasingly uncomfortable and kept glancing at her with undisguised fear. And finally he stammered an excuse and left abruptly, and his entire delegation departed Elvara within hours. Kira asked Luna what had happened, and the human woman smiled slightly and said that the archive had examined the ambassador's intentions and found plans for sabotage and theft, and possibly even assassination, and it had shown him a vision of what would happen if he attempted any of those things, and he had wisely decided to leave. The princess was both grateful and disturbed, and she asked what kind of vision Luna had shown him, and Luna said simply that some species responded better to fear than to diplomacy, and the Krill now understood that Elvara was under protection, that they could not overcome and they would not return with hostile intent. This incident made Kira realize how much she had come to depend on Luna, and the human woman had become not just an advisor, but a guardian and protector. And the princess wondered if that had been Luna's plan all along and to make herself indispensable. But she could not deny the benefits, and Elvara was safer and more prosperous than it had been in centuries, and the people were healthier and happier, and the old, rigid class distinctions were beginning to fade. And even Valen had grown quieter in his opposition, though he never fully accepted the changes. Ember and Frost seemed to have adapted to Luna's presence, and they no longer growled when she approached, though they remained watchful. And Kira noticed that sometimes the dragons would stare at Luna with their ancient eyes, as if trying to understand what she had become. One night Kira had a strange dream, and she stood in a vast library that stretched infinitely in all directions, and the shelves were filled with books and crystals and objects she did not recognize. And Luna stood beside her and gestured to encompass everything, and said this was what the archive looked like from the inside in. The dream Kira could suddenly understand that each book contained the complete history and knowledge of an entire civilization, and some were from species that still existed, while others recorded the final moments of extinct races, and the archive preserved them all and kept their memories alive long after they had vanished from physical reality. 2 years after Luna's return to Elvara, the kingdom had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible before, and the Research Institute had become a hub of innovation that attracted brilliant minds from across multiple star systems, and the technologies Luna introduced had improved every aspect of life, from medicine to agriculture to space travel. But with success came new dangers, and other civilizations grew jealous and fearful of Elvara's rapid advancement. And there were incidents of espionage and attempted sabotage and diplomatic tensions with several neighboring systems, and Kira found herself spending more time managing external threats than internal politics. The Krill Collective had maintained an uneasy peace, but intelligence, reports suggested they were building a military fleet and developing weapons specifically designed to counter elven defenses, and other powers were forming alliances and trading blocs that excluded Elvara in attempts to limit their influence. Kira discussed these developments with Luna during one of their regular evening meetings, and the princess expressed concern that their technological superiority might actually be making them more vulnerable by painting a target on their civilization, and Luna agreed that success always attracted predators. The human woman suggested that it might be time to reveal more of the archive's knowledge and specifically defensive technologies that could protect Elvara from any potential attack, and Kira was hesitant because each new revelation from the archive seemed to push Luna further from her humanity and deepen her connection to the ancient entity. Luna acknowledged the concern, but pointed out that the alternative was to remain vulnerable and hope that diplomacy would be enough. And both of them knew that hope was not a strategy when dealing with aggressive powers like the Krill. The princess made her decision and authorized Luna to develop whatever defensive systems were necessary, and the result was a planetary shield generator, unlike anything that existed in known space, and it created a barrier that could absorb and redirect energy weapons and deflect physical projectiles, and even prevent unauthorized ships from entering Elvara's orbital space. The shield was activated during a public ceremony, and Kira stood with Luna on the palace balcony as the sky shimmered with barely visible energy, and the crowd below cheered and felt safer than they had in years. And Ember and Frost flew overhead, and their roars of approval echoed across the city. But Lord Valen and his remaining supporters saw the shield as proof of their worst fears, and they claimed that Luna was turning Elvara into a fortress and isolating them from the galactic community and making war inevitable through their aggressive posturing. Kira met with Valen one final time and tried to explain that the shield was defensive, not offensive, and it simply ensured that no one could threaten Elvara with force. But Valen was beyond reasoning, and he believed that any reliance on human knowledge was a betrayal of elven heritage. The confrontation ended badly, and Valen declared that he could no longer serve a crown that had abandoned its principles, and he resigned his position and left the capital with his household, and several other noble families followed. And it was a split that would take generations to heal. Luna found Kira in her private chambers that evening, and the princess was staring at a map that showed the provinces that had withdrawn their support. And Luna sat beside her and said nothing at first, and simply offered her presence and companionship. Finally, Kira spoke and said she sometimes wondered if she had made the right choices and if preserving the secret about the royal bloodline was worth all the conflict and division it had caused. And Luna listened and then asked what would have happened if Kira had revealed the full truth from the beginning. The princess admitted that it would have destroyed the monarchy and probably led to civil war and multiple factions fighting for power and possibly the collapse of elven civilization entirely. And Luna nodded and said that Kira had chosen the lesser evil, and sometimes that was all a leader could do. They talked for hours about leadership and responsibility and the weight of keeping secrets, and Kira realized that Luna understood her burden in ways that no one else could, because they both carried knowledge that could destroy or save their people depending on how it was used. As the conversation wound down, Luna hesitated and then said there was something she needed to tell Kira, and something she had been keeping from her, because she was not sure how the princess would react. Kira felt her heart rate increase and told Luna to continue, and the human woman explained that the archive had shown her something recently, and a vision of potential futures, and most of them ended badly for Elvara and for the sector as a whole. In the majority of timelines, the Krill Collective attacked within 5 years, and even with the shield, Elvara would eventually fall, because they were one planet against an empire that controlled dozens of systems, and other powers would either stand aside or join the attack to claim pieces of elven territory and technology. Luna continued and said there was one possible future where Elvara survived and thrived, but it required Kira to make a choice that would change everything, and the princess would need to abandon the isolationist policies that elves had maintained for centuries and instead form a true federation with human colonies and other aligned species. The princess felt overwhelmed and asked why Luna had waited so long to reveal this, and the human woman admitted that she had hoped to find another path in some way to ensure survival without forcing such a dramatic transformation. But the archive was very clear, and isolation meant death and cooperation meant survival. Kira stood and walked to her window and looked out over the city she had sworn to protect. And she thought about her ancestors and the traditions they had maintained, and the pride that defined elven culture. And then she thought about her people and their children and the future they deserved. She turned back to Luna and asked what forming a federation would entail, and Luna explained that it would mean sharing technologies and resources and governance with other species, and elves would no longer be the dominant power but one partner among many, and it would require humility and compromise and a willingness to see other species as equals. The princess laughed bitterly and said that convincing elves to accept other species as equals would be harder than fighting the krill. And Luna smiled slightly and agreed, but said it was possible, and especially with the younger generation who had grown up working alongside humans in the research institute, and who had already begun to question old prejudices. Kira asked for time to consider, and Luna nodded and said she would wait. But time was limited, and the krill were already moving, and their fleet would be ready within 2 years. And Elvara needed to have alliances in place before then, or face annihilation. Over the following weeks, Kira consulted with Theron and other trusted advisors, and she presented the idea of federation carefully, and framing it as a practical necessity rather than an ideological shift, and the reactions were mixed but less hostile than she had feared. Lady Thera surprised everyone by speaking strongly in favor of the plan, and she pointed out that human colonies had resources and population that Elvara lacked, and combining their strengths made strategic sense, and several younger nobles agreed and saw opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. The princess drafted a proposal and sent envoys to the largest human colonies and to several non-human species that had maintained friendly relations with Elvara, and the responses were cautiously positive, and most were willing to discuss terms, though none wanted to commit without understanding the full scope of what Kira was proposing. Luna helped negotiate the details, and her presence reassured the human colonies that this was a genuine offer, rather than an elven attempt to dominate, and her connection to the archive also gave her insights into what each potential partner truly wanted and needed. After 6 months of intense diplomacy, the Federation Charter was complete, and it established a council with representatives from each member species, and created frameworks for shared defense and trade and cultural exchange, and most importantly, it recognized all member species as equals with no one group holding permanent dominance. The signing ceremony was held on Elvara, and representatives from 12 different species gathered in the palace, and Kira stood before them in her formal regalia with Ember and Frost behind her. And she spoke about the challenges they all faced and the strength they could find in unity. She admitted that this was difficult for her people, and elves had long believed themselves superior, but recent years had taught her that wisdom and strength came in many forms, and the future belonged to those who could adapt and cooperate rather than those who clung to isolation and pride. When she signed the charter, her hand trembled slightly because she knew she was ending an era and transforming the monarchy from absolute authority to one voice among many. But she also knew it was necessary. Luna watched from the side of the chamber, and when their eyes met, Kira saw approval and gratitude, and something that might have been relief. And the human woman had given her the information and tools to save her people. But the choice and the courage had been Kira's own. The celebration lasted 3 days and included demonstrations of various species, cultures, and technologies, and art forms, and Kira saw her people beginning to engage with others as equals rather than subjects or inferiors, and she felt hope for the first time in years.